The cowboy had always been a man of solitude. He was used to long hours under the open sky, the cold wind biting his face as he guided his horse across the snow-covered plains. He lived far from towns and villages, in a small cabin that he had built with his own hands, surrounded by endless stretches of frozen land. Years of loneliness had made him quiet and careful, but they had also made him strong, able to survive where most people could not. He was a man who understood the land better than most people understood each other, and he had learned to read the weather, the animals, and the shifting snow like an open book. That Christmas Eve, the world felt quieter than usual. The snow fell softly, blanketing the hills and valleys in white, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The cowboy was traveling along a narrow mountain pass, delivering supplies to a small village that could only be reached by horseback. The path was treacherous. Ice covered the rocks, and a wrong step could send a rider tumbling down into the ravine below. But he had done this many times before, and he knew the risks. He liked to think that this was the life he had chosen, one that required patience, strength, and a respect for the land. As he rounded a bend in the narrow path, he noticed something unusual. A wagon had toppled over near the edge of the trail. Its wooden wheels were broken, and the horses were tangled in the harness. At first, he thought the driver might have been a careless traveler. But, as he approached, he realized the situation was more serious. There was a young woman trapped under the side of the wagon, her tall frame pinned awkwardly by the broken wood. She was a stranger to him, known only in the village as a giant bride, because of her unusual height and her shy, reserved nature. She had recently married, and her life until now had been sheltered and careful. Seeing her there, injured and frightened, struck a chord in the cowboy's heart. The woman was pale, her face streaked with tears and dirt, and she looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. She did not speak much English, and the cowboy did not know the language of her people, so communication was difficult. Still, he could see the pain and fear clearly enough. Her leg was trapped under the wagon, and she could not move. The cold had begun to bite at her skin, and the snow was gathering around her, making it harder to breathe. The cowboy knew that every second counted. There was no time to call for help, and the nearest village was miles away. If he did not act quickly, she could lose her leg, or worse, her life. He dismounted from his horse with careful movements and examined the situation. The wood was splintered, and some of it had pressed deep into her leg. He could see the blood slowly spreading across the snow, and he knew that the cold could make her body go into shock. His mind raced, thinking of the best way to free her without causing more harm. His hands were steady, but inside, he felt a rush of urgency. He had faced danger many times before: wolves in the night, falling rocks, icy rivers, but helping a human in such immediate peril was different. This required careful thought and action, not just strength. "Spread your legs," he said in a firm voice, trying to make himself understood. His words sounded harsh to her, but there was no malice behind them. He only needed her to cooperate, to move in a way that would allow him to lift the wagon just enough to free her leg. She hesitated, trembling, unsure if she could trust him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of danger. The cowboy met her gaze steadily. He understood the fear in her expression. Many people would have panicked, but he knew that she had to act quickly if she wanted to survive. The snow fell harder, covering her hair and shoulders, and he could see her shivering. There was no time for explanations or polite conversation. He had to act. Slowly, carefully, she followed his instructions. He lifted the wagon just enough to ease the pressure on her leg. She cried out softly, and he reassured her with calm gestures. There was no cruelty in his actions, only an urgent determination to save her. The snow was thickening, and the wind howled through the mountains, making it difficult to hear each other. He worked silently but quickly, adjusting his movements to avoid causing more pain. His experience with horses, wagons, and harsh terrain gave him the skill to act decisively. But he had never felt a situation so tense, with a human life at stake. Finally, he managed to free her leg from under the wagon. She collapsed back onto the snow, exhausted and trembling. He wrapped her in his coat to protect her from the freezing wind and checked her injuries. There were deep bruises and cuts, and he could see the beginnings of frostbite on her fingers and toes. He realized that staying out in the cold was dangerous for both of them, and he needed to find shelter quickly. Nearby, he spotted an abandoned cabin, its roof covered in snow but still intact. He helped her to her feet, supporting her carefully as they made their way through the snow. Inside the cabin, the air was still cold, but at least it offered some protection from the wind. The cowboy set her down gently on a pile of old blankets and examined her leg again. He worked slowly, cleaning the wounds and wrapping them as best as he could with the materials he had brought. The woman watched him quietly, her fear slowly giving way to a cautious trust. She could see that he was there to help, not harm, and that he had risked his own safety to rescue her. The fire he managed to light in the cabin cast a warm glow on their faces, and the sound of the wind outside reminded them both of how close danger had been. As the night wore on, the cowboy and the woman shared a silence filled with unspoken understanding. He could see her pain, but also her resilience. She had been scared, yes, but she had followed his instructions, and that had made all the difference. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the mountains in a quiet, white blanket. And inside, the two strangers sat together, bound by circumstance and the urgent need to survive. The cowboy thought about his own life, all the lonely years spent in the cold and isolation. He had never known someone so vulnerable and so strong at the same time. He felt a strange sense of connection, born out of shared hardship and mutual respect. Hours passed slowly. The woman slept for a little while, and the cowboy kept watch by the door, listening for any sounds from the outside. The snowstorm raged, but he felt a quiet confidence that they would both make it through the night. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this was different. This was about caring for someone else. And in that responsibility, he found a sense of purpose he had not known in years. He realized that survival was not just about strength or skill, it was about trust, compassion, and the courage to act when it mattered most. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the cabin window, the storm had begun to ease. The woman was awake, her eyes bright but cautious. She looked at the cowboy, and he nodded to reassure her. They had both survived the night, and though the world outside was still cold and dangerous, they had found a small pocket of safety together. The cowboy helped her to her feet again, supporting her as they prepared to face the journey back to the village. The events of the night had changed them both, leaving a mark of resilience, courage, and a quiet bond formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was a Christmas Eve they would never forget, a night of fear, hope, and the beginning of understanding between two very different lives. The cabin was small, with a single wooden door and a tiny window that had long been cracked and covered with frost. Snow pressed against the glass, making the world outside look distant and quiet. But inside, the tension remained heavy. The cowboy helped the woman settle onto a pile of old blankets. Her leg was still sore, bruised, and swollen from where the wagon had trapped her. She shifted carefully, wincing with every movement, and the cowboy immediately moved closer, supporting her with gentle hands. Though his life had taught him to be strong and quick, this situation required patience and care. Every gesture mattered, and every moment could bring new dangers. She watched him silently, her eyes large and uncertain. Her mind was racing, full of fear and confusion. She had never been outside her village before, and the sudden tumble from the wagon, followed by the arrival of this stranger, had shaken her deeply. She did not understand his language well, but she could see the urgency in his eyes. He was not cruel, he did not smile in a mocking way. He only moved with purpose, trying to keep her safe. Slowly, she began to trust him, though fear still lingered like a shadow. The cowboy knew that simply saving her from the wagon was not enough. The cold was dangerous, and her leg needed proper care to avoid infection. He searched his pack and pulled out a small first aid kit. There were bandages, some clean cloth, and antiseptic. It was not much, but it was enough to stabilize her until help could arrive. He worked carefully, cleaning the cuts and wrapping the leg tightly, but gently. She flinched at first, but he reassured her with soft gestures, pointing to the bandages and nodding as if to say, "This will help you." She nodded back, understanding without words. Outside, the snowstorm had grown stronger. Wind howled through the mountains, rattling the walls of the cabin and shaking the door. The cowboy could hear the branches of nearby trees cracking under the weight of the snow. He knew they could not stay in the cabin forever. Help would not come quickly in this storm, and the path back to the village was still dangerous. They would need to wait until the morning, when visibility improved and the snow softened enough to travel. But for now, they had to survive the night together. The cowboy built a small fire in the cabin's old hearth. The wood was dry, but it was scarce and difficult to light. He struck a match, and the flame flickered, finally catching on a piece of kindling. The fire crackled and hissed, casting a warm glow over the cabin and making the snow outside seem even colder in comparison. The woman watched the fire, fascinated and relieved. She had never seen flames dance like this before, and the warmth made her body relax slightly. For the first time since the accident, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they would make it through the night. The cowboy brought a small piece of cloth and helped her cover herself more fully. Her clothes were wet from the snow, and the cold had seeped into her bones. He moved with quiet care, aware that she was shy and sensitive. She did not speak, but she did not pull away either. Slowly, she began to relax under his calm presence. He could see the tension leaving her shoulders and the fear in her eyes softening. The trust between them was fragile, built in a single night under extraordinary circumstances, but it was growing. As they waited, the cowboy tried to make her feel more comfortable. He gestured toward the fire, mimicking actions like warming hands and stretching slowly. She watched him and began to imitate his movements. It was a small, silent way of communicating, but it worked. They laughed quietly at their awkward attempts to understand each other, and the tension in the room eased slightly. It was a small victory, a moment of lightness in a long, difficult night. Time passed slowly. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in white. But inside the cabin, the two strangers began to feel a strange companionship. The cowboy spoke softly, explaining what he was doing with gestures, pointing to the bandages, the fire, and the blankets. She nodded, trying to understand, and occasionally spoke a few words in her own language. The cowboy listened carefully, picking up the tone and emotion behind her words. Communication was difficult, but understanding could be felt even without perfect language. In this quiet way, they began to connect. Night deepened, and with it came the coldest part of the storm. The wind shook the cabin walls, and the snow piled higher outside. The woman shivered despite the blankets and the fire. The cowboy moved closer, wrapping his coat around her shoulders and placing a hand gently on her arm. She looked up at him, a mix of fear and gratitude in her eyes. He nodded to reassure her. And for a moment, there was a quiet bond, a recognition that they were not alone, and that they could rely on each other. The woman began to tell small stories about her life, gesturing with her hands and speaking in her own language. The cowboy listened with interest, nodding and smiling where he could. Though he did not understand all the words, he understood the feelings behind them, the pride in her family, the excitement and nervousness of her recent marriage, and the fears she had about the wide, unfamiliar world beyond her village. He shared small details of his own life in return, using gestures and simple words. Slowly, the cabin was filled with a quiet, tentative conversation. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and it was human. As midnight approached, the storm seemed to lessen slightly, though the wind still roared outside. The woman had begun to feel stronger, her breathing steadier, and her leg more comfortable thanks to the cowboy's careful treatment. He checked the bandages once more, ensuring they were secure, but not too tight. She watched him, a mixture of awe and respect in her eyes. She had been frightened, unsure of what to expect from a stranger in the middle of a storm. And yet here he was, patiently helping her, showing no fear, no impatience, only focus and care. She realized that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The cowboy settled near the fire, keeping watch over her as she rested. He knew that even small injuries could become serious in such cold and harsh conditions. Frostbite could take hold, and infection could set in if they were not careful. He remained alert, listening for any signs of danger outside falling branches, approaching animals, or sudden changes in the wind. Despite the challenges, he felt a quiet pride in his ability to help her, to keep her safe through the night. This was a different kind of strength than he had known before, not just survival, but compassion, patience, and understanding. Hours passed, and slowly, the night began to yield to the first hints of dawn. The storm outside had calmed, and the snow-covered landscape sparkled in the dim morning light. The woman awoke briefly, looking at the cowboy with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. She had survived the night, and she understood that it was because of him. Her trust in him had grown, and though the experience had been frightening, she felt a new sense of confidence in her ability to face challenges. She realized that sometimes, courage comes not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of someone who cares enough to act. The cowboy helped her sit up and stretch carefully. Her legs still hurt, but the worst was over. They would need to travel to the village soon. But for now, there was a moment of calm. The cabin had sheltered them through the night, and in its quiet warmth, they had discovered something unexpected. A connection born out of crisis. A recognition of each other's humanity, and a silent promise that they would both survive this ordeal together. The fire crackled, the snow sparkled outside, and the cowboy and the woman shared a quiet, unspoken understanding, one that would stay with them long after they left the mountains behind. The morning light crept slowly into the small cabin, casting a soft glow across the snow-covered landscape outside. The wind had calmed, and the storm that had threatened them the night before had passed, leaving the world quiet and still. Inside, the woman stirred, blinking her eyes against the faint light. Her leg was sore, but the bandages had held, and the pain was manageable. She looked at the cowboy, who was busy gathering what supplies he could carry. Though they had shared the night in close quarters, there was still an air of cautious distance between them. They were strangers in many ways, yet the events of the night had drawn them together in a bond, forged by necessity and trust. The cowboy helped her to her feet, supporting her as she tested the strength of her leg. She winced slightly, but she did not collapse. She had survived the worst, and she felt a growing sense of confidence. The cowboy nodded in approval, offering a small smile. It was a rare expression for him. Most of his life had been spent in solitude, and smiles were not common. Yet something about this moment, about the relief and quiet triumph of surviving the night, made him feel lighter. He had acted out of necessity, but now he could see the human impact of his actions: a life saved, a fear overcome, and a trust earned. They prepared to leave the cabin, stepping carefully over the snow that had drifted inside through the cracks in the walls. The woman adjusted her coat, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. The cowboy checked the fire, ensuring it was extinguished before they left, and gathered the remaining supplies. The mountain pass that had been treacherous the night before now seemed gentler in the daylight, but the snow still made travel difficult. He led the way, moving slowly to match her pace, constantly checking to ensure that she did not stumble or strain her injured leg. As they descended the path, the woman began to speak, though her words were halting and mixed with gestures. The cowboy listened carefully, picking up the emotion and intent behind her speech, rather than the exact words. She told him small stories about her village, about her family, and about the customs that had shaped her life. He responded with simple words and gestures, sharing bits of his own life, his days spent in the mountains, and his work with horses and wagons. Though their conversation was limited by language, it was rich in meaning. They were learning to communicate through patience, attention, and shared experience. The journey was slow. The snow was deep in places, and the cold still nipped at their faces. The woman occasionally stumbled, and the cowboy was always there to steady her. At times, she would glance around at the mountains, her expression a mixture of awe and fear. She had never traveled so far from home, and the vastness of the landscape was both beautiful and intimidating. The cowboy understood her feelings well. He had spent years alone in the mountains, and he knew the mixture of wonder and isolation that came with such journeys. He did not speak of it, but his actions, steady, careful, patient, conveyed the same understanding. As they moved, they came across small signs of wildlife tracks in the snow, the distant call of birds, and the occasional rustle of a small animal. The cowboy pointed these out, using gestures to indicate their meaning. The woman watched intently, fascinated by the signs of life that still persisted despite the harsh winter. It was a small lesson in survival and observation, a reminder that the world was full of life, even in the most challenging conditions. She began to mimic his gestures, learning to interpret the tracks and sounds. It was a quiet moment of education, bonding, and shared curiosity, and it brought small smiles to both their faces. Midway through the journey, they encountered a narrow stream partially frozen over. The water flowed quickly beneath a thin layer of ice, and crossing it required careful steps. The cowboy tested each footing before guiding the woman across. She followed his lead, trusting his judgment completely. One slip could have been disastrous, but they made it safely to the other side. She breathed a sigh of relief, and he nodded, acknowledging the successful crossing. It was a simple victory, but in the context of their journey, it felt significant. Every small challenge overcome strengthened the bond between them and reinforced their mutual trust. By midday, they spotted the village in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys and the faint sound of people going about their daily lives. The woman's eyes lit up with recognition and relief. She had made it home, thanks to the cowboy's careful guidance, yet there was still work to be done. Her injuries were minor in the grand scheme of things, but they needed attention from someone familiar with proper care. The cowboy helped her navigate the final stretch of snow-covered path, ensuring she did not stumble or strain her leg. Her family would soon be waiting, and she could feel a mixture of excitement and anxiety at the thought of seeing them. When they reached the village, people emerged from their homes, drawn by the sight of the two travelers. The woman's family rushed forward, their voices filled with concern and relief. The cowboy stepped back slightly, allowing them to tend to her. They asked questions, gestured, and offered thanks, though the language barrier made exact communication difficult. Still, the meaning was clear: she was safe. And the cowboy had played a vital role in that outcome. The woman turned to him, her eyes bright with gratitude. She did not have the words to fully express her thanks, but her expression conveyed more than words ever could. After ensuring that she was in the care of her family, the cowboy prepared to leave. The villagers offered food and shelter, but he politely declined, explaining with gestures that he needed to continue his journey. He had responsibilities to other villages, other paths to traverse, and he could not stay. Yet he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had helped someone in need. It was not heroism in the dramatic sense, but it was a deeply human act of courage and care. As he mounted his horse, he cast one last glance at the woman. She waved, and he waved back. There was a silent understanding between them, a recognition of shared experience, trust, and the impact of a single night of extraordinary circumstances. As he rode away, the cowboy reflected on the events of the past hours. He had faced danger, uncertainty, and the raw elements of winter. Yet he had also witnessed resilience, courage, and the power of trust. The woman had been frightened and vulnerable, yet she had acted with bravery and cooperation. Together, they had navigated a perilous situation, relying on each other in ways neither could have predicted. The mountains stretched endlessly around him, beautiful and harsh, but he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had done something meaningful, something that went beyond survival or routine work. He had made a difference in another person's life. The woman, now safe with her family, also reflected on the experience. She had been terrified, alone, and in pain. Yet she had survived and grown stronger because of the cowboy's actions. She realized that sometimes trust must be given even when fear is present, and that courage can be found in cooperation and understanding. Her view of the world had expanded beyond the boundaries of her village. She understood that there were people willing to help, even strangers, and that human kindness could appear in the most unexpected circumstances. The memory of that night would remain with her forever. A story of survival, trust, and quiet heroism. Even after they went their separate ways, the connection between them lingered. The cowboy continued his journey through the mountains, while the woman returned to her family, carrying the lessons of courage and trust she had learned. They had shared a night that tested their patience, their resilience, and their humanity. Though the snow and cold had been harsh, and though fear had threatened to dominate, they had emerged stronger and wiser. The events of that Christmas Eve would remain etched in their memories, a reminder that even in the coldest, most challenging circumstances, compassion and courage could light the way. The village slowly returned to its routine. But the story of the cowboy and the woman spread quietly among the people. They spoke of the man who had braved the storm, of the young woman who had followed his instructions with courage, and of the quiet heroism that had saved a life. There were no grand celebrations, no dramatic retellings, just the steady acknowledgement of what had occurred. Life continued, but the lessons of trust, patience, and human kindness remained, carried forward by those who had witnessed or heard of the events. In this way, the memory of the night continued, shaping lives in small but meaningful ways. The morning after the storm was calm, quiet, and almost magical. The snow glistened in the sunlight, covering the mountains and valleys in a sparkling white blanket. The world outside seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension and fear of the previous night. Inside the village, life was slowly returning to normal. People emerged from their homes to clear snow, tend to animals, and check on neighbors. Yet, the story of the cowboy and the young woman who had been saved from the accident had begun to spread quietly. Carried in whispers and small conversations, everyone had heard of the stranger who had braved the storm and the danger to protect someone in need. The woman, now safely back with her family, felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and curiosity. She was still shaken from the previous night, but her leg was healing, and she was warm and secure. Her parents and relatives fussed over her, checking her injuries, offering food, and providing comfort. She told them bits and pieces of the story, using gestures and the limited words she could find in English. They listened carefully, nodding and murmuring words of approval, impressed by her courage and grateful for the help she had received. Though the language barrier made full explanation difficult, the meaning was clear. A stranger had saved her life, and she owed him her deepest thanks. The cowboy, meanwhile, was already on his way through the mountains, guiding his horse carefully along the narrow, snow-covered paths. He had been through many harsh winters, but this experience stayed with him in a way others did not. The memory of the woman's wide, fearful eyes, the urgency of freeing her from the wagon, and the quiet trust she had placed in him formed a vivid picture in his mind. He realized that his life of solitude, of quiet work and constant vigilance, had been interrupted by something meaningful. He had acted because it was necessary, but the impact went far beyond mere survival. As he rode, he thought about the lessons of the night. He understood that human kindness often required courage, patience, and quick thinking. It was not always enough to be strong physically. One had to be strong in mind and heart. The woman had demonstrated courage as well, following his instructions despite fear and confusion. Together, they had faced danger, uncertainty, and the harshness of winter. And together, they had prevailed. He carried this understanding with him, feeling a quiet pride that came not from recognition, but from knowing he had made a positive difference in someone's life. Back in the village, the young woman gradually regained her strength. Her family continued to care for her, helping her move carefully and attend to her injuries. She reflected on the events of the night with growing clarity. What had frightened her most at first, the fall, the cold, the unknown stranger, had become a story of resilience and trust. She realized that fear, though powerful, could be managed when guided by calm and capable hands. She began to speak more confidently about her experience, teaching others in her family the importance of staying calm in emergencies and recognizing acts of courage when they occurred. The villagers, hearing the story, began to appreciate the quiet heroism of the cowboy. They spoke of his bravery, not as a tale of adventure, but as an example of what it meant to act for the good of others. The story spread slowly, carefully, without exaggeration. People marveled at how he had faced the storm, assessed the danger, and guided the young woman to safety. They admired the calm and decisive way he had acted, even under extreme pressure. Though he had already left, the impression of his actions lingered, leaving a sense of respect and gratitude in the community. The young woman herself grew in confidence. Her experience had shown her that courage could be found in unexpected places, and that trust could be extended even in the most uncertain situations. She realized that human connections, even brief ones, could leave lasting impressions. The memory of the cowboy, his steady hands, and his careful guidance became a source of inspiration for her. She felt a new sense of independence, knowing that she had survived not just because of the cowboy's help, but also because she had followed his instructions and acted with courage herself. As the days passed, the woman returned to her normal routine in the village, though she was changed by the experience. She approached her tasks with more confidence, helped others in need, and shared the story of the night she had been saved. She emphasized the importance of calm thinking, trust, and cooperation, turning her personal experience into a lesson for others. The villagers appreciated her honesty and the clarity with which she recounted the events. They were reminded that heroism did not always appear in dramatic or public ways. Sometimes it appeared in quiet, decisive actions that made a real difference in someone's life. The cowboy, traveling further into the mountains, reflected on the meaning of the night as well. He understood that life often presented unexpected challenges, and that the measure of a person's character was revealed in how they responded. He had chosen to act quickly and decisively, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The knowledge that his actions had saved a life and left a lasting impact on another person gave him a quiet satisfaction. He felt that his solitude, his long hours in the mountains, had prepared him for moments like this, moments where skill, patience, and compassion mattered most. As winter continued, the cowboy continued his work, delivering supplies and helping where needed. But the memory of that Christmas Eve remained with him. He often thought of the young woman, wondering how she was faring and hoping that she continued to grow stronger and more confident. Though they had only shared a brief time together, the bond they had formed through trust, cooperation, and shared hardship stayed with him. He understood that true connection did not always require long acquaintance or shared history. Sometimes, it was forged in a single night of courage and care. Back in the village, the young woman reflected on the importance of human kindness and trust. She realized that life was unpredictable and that danger could appear suddenly. But she also learned that help and courage could appear in equal measure. Her family and the villagers spoke often of the incident, not as a story of fear, but as a story of resilience, bravery, and the quiet acts of heroism that sometimes went unnoticed. The lessons she had learned became part of her daily life, a reminder that courage, trust, and compassion could guide actions and strengthen character, even in the most challenging circumstances. The story of the night slowly became a quiet legend within the village, not one of grand adventure, but one of human connection, survival, and moral courage. The young woman continued to grow, using the experience as a source of strength and inspiration. The cowboy, meanwhile, continued his solitary life, enriched by the knowledge that he had helped another person survive against the odds. Both carried the lessons of that Christmas Eve with them, a reminder that even in moments of fear and uncertainty, trust, courage, and kindness could prevail. As the first spring snow began to melt, the memory of that night lingered. The village returned to normal routines, but the story of the young woman and the cowboy remained in hearts and minds. It was a story of survival, yes, but also a story of understanding, respect, and human connection. For the cowboy, it was a confirmation that his skills and instincts had a purpose beyond survival. For the young woman, it was a lesson in courage, trust, and resilience. And for the village, It was a reminder that true heroism often comes quietly, in the form of actions guided by compassion and a steady hand in times of crisis. The cowboy never returned to the village, but his impact endured. The young woman continued to live her life, more confident, stronger, and inspired by the lessons of the night. She shared them with others, ensuring that the story would continue to teach and inspire long after the storm had passed. It was a quiet, enduring legacy, one born not of fame or wealth, but of courage, trust, and the simple, powerful act of helping another human being when it was needed most.